So in this video, I'm going to present the Jeffersonian transcription system and work through the logic that sits underneath that system to allow you to make the appropriate choices as you're balancing your research in ethnomethodology or conversation analysis. First and most important things to understand when it comes to the Jeffersonian transcription system is that all transcription is interpretation. We're making interpretations of the sounds that occur in real life. Those sounds that occur in real life are actually rendered slightly differently as it comes to different recording devices. Yeah, everybody's heard of the scratching on a phonograph, or the fuzz of the older recording devices from the 80s, cassette tapes, versus the sort of crisp digital of today. But that's still somehow not the same as hearing it yourself when you're there in the real world. So there's a layer of interpretation by the media devices, and then from the media devices to the page, there's a further layer of interpretation of what elements of sound are we going to represent and what elements of sound don't we need and what are we going to leave out, which has led to a variety of different transcription systems. Transcription systems that everyday people might be used to would be the orthographic system. You see that used in court reporting or journalism or in academia. You'll see that in many interviews. Will be given in that orthographic style where there might be line numbers. It'll typically refer to the speakers involved in the interaction. There'll be different ways of referring to the speakers depending on the orthographic transcripts. And most importantly, it's going to remove a lot of the phonetic detail. It'll often correct the grammar. It'll take out pauses. All of these parts aren't necessary to the work of a court transcript, right? So it's sort of meeting the needs of the particular institution that it's involved in. In contrast to that, we have a system like the Mondada system for the transcription of embodied conduct, or multimodal analysis, as it's often called. And that's a very fine-grained system of looking at gesture, looking at gaze, looking at other elements of the body as they are coordinated with talk and interaction. And we've got a really fine-grained way of dealing with, when we look at people, when we look away from people, when we're doing gestures, how they're evolving, how they're changing, how they're shifting, and how we're interacting with the real world over the course of actual live talk. Of course, that's a different system than the talk itself, and it's an additional further layer that you might see referred to. And then in competition with the Jeffersonian system, we have systems like the GAT2 system that was developed by Selting et al. There are other discourse analytic systems out there. There's the use of the International Phonetic Alphabet in linguistics. Many other systems besides exists. However, the Jeffersonian system is the standard for conversation analytic and much ethnomethodological research, and that's what we're going to be presenting in this video. And this Jeffersonian system has priorities. It has certain needs that it cares about and certain things that it doesn't care about, in the same way that orthographic transcripts and the Mondada transcripts and the GAT2 transcripts do. In the Jeffersonian system, developed by Gail Jefferson as she was working with Harvey Sachs and Emanuel Shegloff on the basic turn-taking paper and developing her own research on repair and interaction, she was interested in how do we represent those parts of interaction that speakers seem to be taking as relevant to this work that we're organizing, this work that we're exploring, namely repair and turn-taking. So the Jeffersonian system deals largely with the parts of interaction that are oriented to how it is that we manage who gets to say what and when, in addition to other sensitivities of like correcting and fixing the talk as it occurred. right? And so that results in a system of representation that has been quite useful to a range of other research and other topics in the field. You'll see it used when we're dealing with knowledge. You'll see it used in all sorts of other places for conversation analysis, not just turn taking. But the basic system was developed with that purpose. So there's certain priorities for that system. In addition, academic writing has priorities. So after the system of representation was developed, there were certain sort of extra parts that were added onto it in the background as part of the hidden curriculum of conversation analysis. And in that hidden curriculum, there are certain pieces that you need to know in order to sort of meet the assumptions of the field, the assumptions of turn taking, and the needs of academic writing as it comes to how we're doing it. And I'll step those out first. And finally, of course, your research has priorities. Individual researchers will vary in their use of the Jeffersonian system because you only need to represent what is relevant to both your analysis and the participants in an interaction. So if you're not dealing with repair and you're not dealing with some of the fine-grained stuff, you might find that the more detailed approach isn't necessary in an interaction. However, the important point is that you don't necessarily know what's relevant until you've done the analysis. And you ought to do the transcription prior to doing the analysis. So it is best approach in conversation analysis to do as detailed a transcript as you can have the space and bandwidth for your analysis as the kind of first pass of analysis in interaction. It's the point at which you get familiar with your transcript and familiar with your data. And the more detail you go into there, the better you will be. So how do we actually do this transcription process? How do we start this whole thing off? Well, you've got to have two things. You've got to have a way of doing playback, and you've got to have a place to type and put that playback, a word processing system. I'll talk first about the different playback choices that are currently relatively common. So the playback for the best control of the audio, you're going to want to have something that's what's called a waveform on there. That's the up and down of the frequency of the voice and the frequency of the sound that you can see there in that image on in the middle of the page. That waveform is a visual cue to the researcher that allows you to make selections of certain parts of talk that can be really powerful in sort of teasing out the timing of certain elements of what occurs in interaction. Also, it tends to be the case that software that has this waveform has a zoom function, i.e. that you can zoom right in on smaller parts of the talk because the waveform is used in editing, but you ought not need to do much editing. But because you can zoom in, you can also get this finer control and you can work out exactly when things occur. So you can actually use it to do things like timing how long a pause is, or working out by selective use of the cursor exactly how overlap happens and these kinds of things. There are three recommendations that I would make in terms of which programs to use. Audacity is free and works on most systems. I say most systems because it doesn't work on iPads or Chromebooks. But for anything other than an iPad or a Chromebook, Audacity is a good low-budget option. If you have budget, I recommend Adobe Audition because it's got the slightly more powerful processor behind it. It's just as user-friendly as Audacity. In fact, it's probably more user-friendly than Audacity with some more intuitive approaches to it. And it has the spectral pitch in there. So you can actually get a pitch display out of Adobe Audition once you start to get more familiar with the program. And you'll see an example of a pitch display later on. The final recommendation I would give is this the website audiomass.co. That's for the ultra-light, ultra-budget, platform-independent choice that you can use pretty much anywhere. It doesn't work too great on mobile devices, but on most other devices, it works wonderfully. It does the playback, it does simple editing, it lets you zoom in, it lets you select everything you need. So for the kind of lighter choice, AudioMass is a great go-to, but there's so many different choices you could use. You could use the linguistic system Prat, CLAN, ELAN. You could use the more conventional GarageBand or SoundForge or WavePad or anything along those lines. So long as it has that waveform in there, the more powerful approach to the recording. And what I recommend against is using simple media players like a Windows media player or the iTunes or the regular playback. Don't use those because you don't have the ability to have that same zoom in, the looping, the pausing on your playback. So the second problem is how do we format this? How do we set it up on the page? And to sort of give you the lead into that, I'm going to show you a Jeffersonian transcript and show you the important parts of that transcript. The first thing to note here is that this is in Courier New font, with the exception of the numbers down the side because the way that this has been set up. The Courier New font here is a true type font, so it's got a fixed width for every character on the page, which allows us to do some important things with respect to pausing that I'll talk about in a moment. But setting up in this Courier or Courier New or any true type font really, but ideally Courier or a Courier New is the convention, allows for a more consistent setup. The second thing to note is numbers running down each row of the page on the left-hand side. There's a number of different ways to set that up that I'll talk about, but this is with respect to turn-taking, one of the key parts to talk about to allow a differentiation between say line 46 there, I went through all see look, and line 47 at the end, look at that. You can, in the text, refer to different line numbers when you're doing your analysis, allowing for a little bit more finesse as we're doing this fine-grained conversation analytic approach. The second thing to note is the placement of the text. So it's all in line, which about 5 spaces from the furthest speaker on the left-hand side. This allows us to put in right-facing arrows to highlight particular parts because we don't use bold because bold has a tendency to be inconsistent. You will occasionally see the use of bolding in some transcripts, but mostly we use right-facing arrows to highlight particular parts of the text, and you'll see that in, for instance, Emmanuel Shegloff's work quite consistently. So those right-facing arrows we need to give space to, and we give that space by spacing it out consistently like that. And the final thing to note is that true type font actually allowed us to format this what's called overlap here, where they're speaking at the same time in 38 and 39, by moving the text further in. And by putting it in a true type font, we were actually able to just use the space bar to move it all across. And I say the space bar in particular because tab marks have an awful habit of getting misinterpreted at different widths by different computer programs. So if you have, if you're dealing with an editor at a journal, and you will be, your transcripts might get mangled. If you're dealing with other co-authors, your transcripts might get mangled as they put it into a different word processor, or even the same word processor, just with slightly different settings. It's really, really important to set your transcripts up without any tab marks in them and just use the space bar to do all of the spacing. So I try to use the space bar to space everything out. You can fix the character width on all of your speaker names. Some people use just three-letter acronyms or 3-letter abbreviations. I like to make them a little bit more readable, so I have slightly longer names, and I've put the full names in here. So that's a note about spacing. In Google Docs, if you're using Google Docs, you want to uncheck automatically detect lists to turn the automatic numbering off, because if automatic numbering is on, then it's going to insert tabs in there and we'll run into all those problems. So you'll need to manually number your transcripts. In Word, you can get away with automatic numbering. This is what it looks like on a PC. You would just turn off then set the number position to 0, set the text indent to 0, and take the follow number with tab character and set that to nothing. And then you'll just use the space bar to align everything, and you can get away with automatic numbering. You can also embed it in the margin. Embedding in the margin has the weakness of that you can't control the font, which is why the fonts in my transcripts are actually in the line numbers are a little different, but that doesn't actually impact the spacing on the page. So the font there actually isn't an impediment. So there's a number of different choices to get that line numbering set up. But let's actually look at some symbols now. So I said that Jeffersonian had some priorities with respect to the turn. To highlight why that's important, I'm going to look at our first transcript that we're going to talk about a little bit. It's a discussion 4 folks are having on an Instagram Live about different wellness options and sleep options. They've on the topic of CBD at the moment. They've got a CBD producer on. It's a Instagram run by a lady by the name of Joanne on the top left-hand side in one of the bonnets, with her friend Dr. Yaba Blay on the right-hand side at the top. You'll see the picture in a moment. And another friend, Kat, down the bottom left. So I'm going to show you an orthographic transcript of it, and we'll compare that orthographic transcript with the Jeffersonian transcript, along with playing the recording.
I want to speak on behalf of all of the people in the audience who are like me and don't have quite the attention span or the interest in science, because y'all are nerding out, and
I'm having such a good time.
So a couple of things I want to note here. First of all, this is not line numbering down every part of the page. Not every orthographic transcript even has line numbers, but it's quite common in orthographic transcripts to do line numbers per turn rather than line number per row on the page. So this is what it looks like in an orthographic version. We wouldn't do this in a Jeffersonian version, and you'll see the Jeffersonian version in a second. Second of all, we correct for grammar. So the I don't, you'll actually see slightly different when you look at the Jeffersonian version in a second. And finally, they often would completely remove laughter, but I've put the laughter in here with the gloss laughs in line 5 for Zach, the CBD producer down the bottom. We actually try to represent the specific detail of what was said using the writing system as best we can in the Jeffersonian approach. So in a Jeffersonian system, it would look like this. And you can see there in line 7 the I don't instead of I don't. You can see the laughter done in laughter pulses in line 8 with the ha ha ha. And you can also see the overlap is being represented here. So using the brackets, I've actually shown that people are speaking at the same time here. And this people speaking at the same time is actually really interesting for one of the important parts of turn taking. In addition to the overlap, which is one important element of who gets to talk and when, they're also showing that turns are complete. By coming in at the same time as a speaker, they're showing that you can take a long turn, but that these long turns are sort of put into chunks, what we call turn construction units. And we mark these turn construction units with what we call terminal intonation, the intonation that happens at the end of one of these chunks of talk. This terminal intonation, we can see the people in the interaction themselves are orienting to. Zach, Joanne, and Dr. Yaba Blay, all in line 2, 3, and 4, treat Zach's first utterance exactly as potentially complete. So Zach has more to say, but Joanne also wants to contribute, and Dr. Yaba Blay wants to contribute, and they come in all in overlap, treating this exactly as a sufficient contribution to the turn at hand. And so it's this term construction unit that the intonation mark is a key part of. What is intonation, right? So intonation itself is the relative change in frequency across the course of an utterance. It's the change in the amplitude of what is happening in the voice. And the terminal intonation is that change across the end of an individual utterance. And I say utterance specifically here because we're not just talking about sentences. Exactly is an example of a word, there might be a phrase, and individual turns might be chopped together out of, made together out of multiple utterances stitched together to make a long turn. Basically, anytime you take a breath is going to be an example of a place where a terminal intonation is likely to occur. I've used a pitch trace here to actually show the change in the frequency as it occurs, and I'll play this sound for you in a moment, but you can actually see the shift down in the frequency of the intonation as it's represented by the program part.
So it's just filling in the gap.
So at the end there, you can see that shift downwards. And that shift downwards is represented by the period. We have for terminal intonation in conversation analysis in the Jeffersonian system, a number of different symbols that we use to show the movement of the intonation at the ends of these chunks. So we don't show all of the intonation, we don't show all of the frequency of the voice. There are other systems that do that. But in this system, we have the rising intonation is shown with a question mark. Falling intonation is shown with a period. Slight rises are done with a comma. Level pitch is done with a underscore, and a mid-rise is done with an upside-down question mark. If you're unsure between a slight rise and a mid-rise, it doesn't really matter too much, so long as you're marking the difference between rising and falling, and you're sufficiently marking the terminal intonation on the transcript. What's important to note is that we're not using them grammatically. So you'll have a temptation to want to put the question mark on questions. But routinely in interaction, participants don't put question mark on questions, or sometimes they use that rising intonation on something that's formatted grammatically as a statement to do questioning with it. And you can sort of hear that playing out in the voice. So for an example of that, here's a little bit later in the conversation. And you'll pay attention to line 71, Joanne's question about the different numbers.
So that people understand. So you have like a menu that you go through of numbers. What's that?
So the what's that, if you listen to it, you can actually hear that it's going down. So I've given it a period, a falling intonation. That doesn't mean that it's just a statement. It is actually doing questioning. She's seeking information or providing a prompt for her co-participants to provide more about it. And I've used the period to mark it. So that's terminal intonation.
On behalf
it's like
all of the people in the audience who are like me and don't have quite the attention span or the interest in science, because y'all are nerding out, and
I'm having such a good time.
So listening to this again, we can actually see a number of different points in interaction where participants potentially could have come in. So we saw that they did come in at the end of line 7 and partway through line 2. But there were a number of other points where Dr. Yabablay was potentially complete in that longer turn, 4 to 7, where I've marked these terminal intonations. And there's a number of different terminal intonations that I've marked. We've got the periods for the falling intonation in line 5 and line 6. And then at the end of line 6, I've actually got the rising intonation there. But you can see that she's not asking a question at all there. So it's not done grammatically. It's done because at the end of the turn, interest in science, it's going up. And I didn't do a terminal intonation at the end of I don't, because she's not actually complete there. She's not actually potentially done. The couple of principles there is that it doesn't have to go at the end of lines. It goes at the participant end of the chunk of talk. The chunk of talk could be longer than a sentence. It could be shorter than a sentence. It could be just a part of a phrase. It's what people treat as a chunk. So next we have overlap and tempo. Overlap, tempo, pausing, the different elements of speed, which are also important to taking turns in conversation. These different symbols, we've seen the brackets for overlap. The key note there is that overlap involves two people talking at the same time. So that requires you to put the brackets on each speaker's turn. And also, you actually put them partway through the turn. So you place the brackets exactly where the overlap starts, and you'll note precisely where the overlap ends. You don't put it around the entire turn of talk like you do conventionally with grammar. You actually put it partway through the talk, precisely where it occurs. With going faster, you use the inwards carets. With going slower, you use the outwards carets. Fast and slow is relative to its own speaker's talk. So if somebody's from somewhere and they just have a generally slow pace of voice, you don't mark it as slower. But if they slow down relative to themselves, then you would. We also have this thing, what's called a latch, where there's a very little gap placed between utterances, and to show that somebody has kind of rushed through rather than done the normal kind of beat 0.2 seconds or so of transition, we use the equal sign. You can show like a kind of pulse speed up, which like gradually trails away with just a single caret. And we show pauses as well. We show pauses in seconds and tenths of a second with round brackets there. So see what that looks like. We've got the overlap. The key note about the overlap, I want you to look at line 7 and line 9. You can see that I've spaced further out across the page to show exactly where the overlap occurs. And it's not just going around the entire turn. So I haven't got brackets around all of Yaba's turn. I've put it precisely where it occurs. And you can also see in here, we've got the tempo marks. So Joanne slows down a little bit in line 10. Likewise, Dr. Yaba speeds up a little bit when she's in overlap in line 11. And finally, partway through her turn, she pauses for about 0.8 of a second as she's kind of gathering her thoughts there after the A key point to contrast is that we don't always put pauses on a speaker's line. We put pauses on a speaker's line when it's within an utterance, when they definitely haven't finished yet. Instead, you can see in line 44, the pause, the 1.2 second pause that happens on its own line after "and I trust her." And I've put that on its own line because it occurs after a chunk of talk. It occurs after an utterance. So anybody could be potentially saying something. So I don't want to claim that an individual person owns that silence. They're not responsible for speaking then. So anybody's responsible for speaking, that pause goes to the conversation as an object rather than an individual. So you're kind of making an ontological claim when you place it on an individual speaker's turn. So generally, it's best to assume that pauses are going to go on their own line. We're moving at lightning speed through these different symbols. Now we're on to the kind of peripheral symbols that were more associated with delicacy and sensitivity and developed sort of more in the context of repair. And these might include symbols such as being louder, softer, shifts in pitch, the use of emphasis, the way that laughter is deployed, the way that stretch is deployed, all of these different parts. So when you're being louder, you put a word in all caps. When you're being softer, you put the degree symbol around it, the word. In Microsoft Word, that involves you finding the symbol and inserting it. You can also just Google the Unicode for degree symbol. You put an upwards arrow at the start of the utterance that has the higher pitch to show a rise in pitch, and you put likewise a downwards arrow before a fall in pitch to show a lowered pitch. A pitch shift is a whole octave, and don't be tempted to use these on shifts in intonation. You're looking for quite a significant shift in sound to use for a pitch shift. Emphasis is essentially where something is either slightly louder or slightly longer in order to emphasize that part of the talk. You can also use the louder and longer representations that we have, but it falls outside the normal stress pattern of the language. So it's showing that it's emphasizing, as I just did there, that particular word. We show laughter with the specific pulses, as we saw with Zach at the start. You can also show when somebody's laughing through a word by putting the H's in round brackets through the actual word as they occur. When we stretch out something, stretch out typically a vowel, but it might be a glide, we use the colons to represent that. And you can choose with glides that you might want to, instead like a Y or a W, you might want to just put multiple consonants. And we have a creaky voice and smile voice. I haven't put smile voice on here, but you will actually see it. Creaky voice is the asterisk, and smile voice is the money symbol. It varies between America and the United Kingdom for obvious reasons.
Stimulated by the light and by the everything, right? But once Kat told me about Blue Forest, and I trust her. So I went to Blue Forest. I went through all of, see, look, ignorant internet changed my whole life. Look at that.
So,
I know y'all
okay.
are into science, but
So we're listening to this section of the talk to listen to the look at that at line 47. There's a significant shift in her frequency. She's shifts the pitch up just about an octave as she says, look at that, to call out ignorant internet who had just logged on to the Instagram live at that point. You can also see emphasis in here at line 47 and 43, the underlining to show that they're being emphasized. They're slightly longer and slightly louder than the surrounding talk. In contrast, to show the rest of the symbols, we're going to jump to a new example. This is to, the next example is to linguistic students who are participating in course credit. They are sitting down in a lounge, just chatting to each other, like taking the recording for the linguistics assignment, so they know they're being recorded. We'll skip past this one.
I cut mine, and not obviously as short as yours, but it's different.
It's noticeable, yeah.
You got those Spanish curls down.
So the different symbols we hear in this case are that as Mia and Riley are talking to each other about their struggles with hair, Riley responds to Mia's story about waking up with Christmas hair with the oh no. That's got a whole host of symbols to it. So it's slightly softer. So I've put the degree symbols in there. It is latched, so it occurs less than a beat of silence after she ends. So I've put the latch symbol for the rush through. She's got what's called smile voice on there, so her mouth is actually up in a smile, and you can actually hear the acoustic properties of that. So I've put the dollar symbol on there for that, and she's laughing through the words themselves. So I've put the laughter particles that are coming out as she is deploying the words actually mid-word. Makes it relatively hard to pass, relatively hard to read. So it's like the full deployment of everything. But there's actually a number of other different spots of quiet talk here. Mia, for instance, with her assessment, it's noticeable in line 10, which also has a shift down in pitch at the end. Likewise, her sort of aborted laughter in line 8. All have the different pitch. Note the rising intonation on the "We Got the Spanish Girl" style at line 13. There's a few more of the symbols and some audio to go with it. So with this very sort of quick run through of the assumptions underneath the transcription system, you can start to make some of those interpretations for yourselves. As you're making these interpretations for your own individual transcriptions, balancing the conventions of the field and the needs of your analysis and respecting the orientations of your participants, because what your participants up to is ultimately our responsibility as analysts to work with. Respecting that in the appropriate ways to them and to their analysis is really part and parcel of being a conversation analytic researcher, and the rubber really hits the road with that. It really gets real with that when we're dealing with transcription. So hopefully this has given you something to start with, something to work with, dealing with those intonation points and pauses and the practicalities of actually getting the audio going and all of that. You'll have something to work with from there.